Hey everybody, it's Margo here at My Favorite Quilt Store, and I'm doing the last installment of 4 on the solar flare. So what I wanted to show you is we're on the very last page of the solar flare book, and we're going to be adding the first outer border, which is this purple round, and then we're going to be adding the next round, which is the little small squares of color. So first of all, what we're going to do is we are going to measure our quilt to see what size we really need the first borders to be. So let's get over and take a look at how to measure the quilt. All right, now we're ready to measure the quilt to put on the borders. So when you're measuring your quilt, you want to lay it out. If you have a large surface to lay it completely out, that works. You can also do it on a design wall, or you can do it on top of a bed, but you need something that's a little bit firm. So what I have done is I've folded mine in half. Because it's a square, you can do it this way. And I folded mine in half, and it is exactly meets on all four corners exactly, so that I know that I'm good as far as my measurement. So it probably says in the directions how much you need to measure and cut these, but I would go ahead and measure your quilt, because the reason you measure your quilt is to make sure that they are going to fit and that there was no changes, because everyone's quarter inch is a little different. Everything's a little different, the way they sew things. I've also removed all of my paper from the back of my quilt at this point in time. So my quilt is completely free of paper on the back side, so it folds nicely and it's flexible like the quilt will be. When you're pulling out the paper, be very careful that you don't stretch the fabric, and because these are all bias strips and different kinds of strips that possibly could stretch when you're pulling off the paper. So we're going to measure from this end, and you start at one end and you hold it down and you measure all the way across, and make sure your quilt is nice and flat as you're measuring across. And I'm measuring for both sides at the same time. So it comes out to be 48 1/8 of an inch. 48 1/8 of an inch. So now I'm going to measure the top of my quilt, or the middle of my quilt, sorry, to see if it has the same measurement. The good news is that the center of the quilt is right in the middle of the 24 inches is right in the middle of the center of the square here. So let's see what this measures. So this measures 48 and maybe a 1/8 of an inch less than 48. So this is about a 1/4 of an inch different between the middle and the edges. So what I'm going to do is when I'm doing my when I'm sewing on my borders, I'm going to make them exactly 48 inches and make them kind of halfway in between those two. So you want to make sure that both of your edges of your borders are exactly the same. So I have got both of my pieces for my borders lined up down here, because I'm going to pin them at the exact same time and get them ready. I am not going to, so this end I have not cut off the salvages. So I'm going to start somewhat in on the fabric. So I have like a little bit of a tail over here in case something goes wrong or something happens. When I'm sewing, I still have some area on this side to make it straight. So I'm going to take this and put a pin here at the beginning mark on this particular border. And I'm going to do the same thing on the one below it, because I'm making these exactly the same size. Because that's the key to each of your borders, if you make them exactly the same size. So this one I'm pinning right here, and they're on top of one another. And so now we're going to measure. I'm going to actually measure to the center, which would be half of 48, which would be 24. I'm going to put a pin in the center of the one below, and then a pin in the center of the one above. So I've got the centers pinned. Gonna come back here, make sure that is exactly in the center, and it is at 24 inches. So now I'm gonna get 2 more pins I'm using my flathead flower pens. This is not on the quilt, it's on a flat surface. It's not on the quilt, it's on a flat surface before I even begin to sew. So now I'm putting my pen at 48 inches, and this should be where the end of it comes onto my quilt. So I've got these pinned at where I want to have the beginning and the end and the middle. I am not going to cut these off at this point. I got the bottom half pinned. I'm not going to cut them off at this point, because what I want to do is I want to come over here, and so this one's going to go on this side, because I'm going to trim them up after I sew them on. And I'm only going to attach this one inner border at a time. So I'm going to open up the quilt, lay it flat, and I'm going to put this even with the side over here, because this is my starting corner, and I'm going to pin it right sides together. I'll put my first pin right here, kind of a little ways in from this is the edge that I want to line up. This one is going to go right in the middle of the quilt, and the good news is that this particular line is the middle of your quilt, because this is where the two come together. So it should line up exactly there in the middle of your quilt. I'm gonna pull this pin back because it does match up exactly in the middle of my quilt. Right there. And then I'm gonna come down and measure here. See that this is the edge of my quilt. So what you want to not do is stretch this piece as you're pinning it down, and you want to use as many pins as you're going to need to keep it straight and intact when you're sewing. So I'm going to come back and put another pin halfway between these two pins, and then I'm going to come. If you didn't have this as your center of your quilt, if you couldn't identify the center of your quilt, what you would do is you would sew, you would fold the quilt in half, identify the center of the quilt, and mark it so that you would know where you were, where the center of the quilt was that you needed to pin to. So then I'm going to come back and I'm going to go in between these two, put one more pin in here. One more pin here. And so once I get this number of pins in, I feel comfortable that I'm going to have enough pins in. But let's say you had a quilt that had a little bit of bowing to it, or that you needed to take it in a little smaller for it to be perfect. You would have to add more pins so that you didn't get a ridge or a tuck in your border. So I'm going to have this pinned. Now what I'm going to do is flip the quilt around to the other side and pin the other side of the border exactly the same on the other side of the quilt. Then once I get these two borders sewn, I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, sew it, iron it, and then cut off the excess that I have and measure for the next borders. So I'm going to leave you here and get this done and bring it back when we're for the next step. Hey everybody, it's Margo back, and I've got my friend Risa here. How you doing?
Doing great, Margo. Thank you.
Good. And we've got the solar flare spread out on the table. I have finished putting the borders on, and I know we dropped off last time. I've got half the video, left the video last time when we were putting on the borders, and we were trying to put on the second border. I got the first borders on, and everything measured perfectly, but I still had kind of a little bit of a bubble in the quilt. So I went back and I started measuring all of the blocks and how they came out. And I found that this particular block on all four sides were different measurements. And that was causing some of my problems.
Absolutely.
And so I ended up doing, because this navy comes in right here, I ended up taking like a 1/16 of an inch off of two of the sides to take care of how the bubble was. And so there's a number of different reasons we've come up with why this could be. And so if you have this problem with your quilt, what I would suggest is you measure, like we measured all of the different squares to make sure that they were exactly the same at the top and at the bottom. And
Right.
on everything to
On
see
each
on each
repetition.
repetition to see where they didn't match up. And you might need a sheet of paper to write it down, but these varied anywhere from 15 and a half to 16 inches. So there was a quarter of an inch off on some of these. So I had removed my paper before I put the borders on. And that's because what I wanted to make sure that it laid flat and that it was square. At that particular point, you don't want to cut off anything off the quilt because this is not where you really square up the quilt.
Right.
But
No,
to make sure that the borders lay flat, you need to have a square quilt.
absolutely.
And it needs to lay somewhat flat, but you're working all with bias edge along here, and so when you pull the paper off, there's a chance you're going to have a little distortion.
Yes.
And the paper is thick, so we
Yes.
don't know if it was that, or maybe there was a piece that didn't get pulled over far enough that had
When
a
you
little
do
bit
the
of a gap in
pressing.
it. When you do the pressing, you didn't pull it tight enough, and so therefore it did not lay flat enough
Right.
for what we needed for this. So we did have a little extra. So from my garment days, I knew that if you take a dart,
Right.
you can take some of the fullness out
Absolutely.
and give it a little bit more of a form fixture. And this particular area right here gives you that ability to, because the fabrics come together, they're dark, they are also,
And they're not going to match anyway, the pattern
right, the
wise.
pattern, it has a lot of pattern to it. So what I did was I took a slight, like a 16th of an inch, which means I'm taking an 1/8 of an inch.
Right.
Because it's a 16th on each side. I took like a 16th of an inch dart in these on two sides to make it lay flatter and so that it will hang straighter in the long run. The other thing, my quilt's a little different from the pattern in that I used a little bit wider border because I did all 4.5 inch squares all the way around because I wanted mine to be, I didn't want to have the purple in the border, so I wanted to be able to take a couple of the colors out and get it to fit. So what I did was measure the quilt to figure out what I needed to make this size divisible by 4. So I needed to add another 1/2 inch to this, or an inch to the outside border here, and that gave me enough room to use my 4.5 inch squares all the way around the outside. So I did do them in the colorations of the light to dark all the way around and light to dark. So I'm pretty pleased with the way it came out.
It's breathtaking.
But
it's absolutely breathtaking.
On this table, it does show that it doesn't lay 100% flat. So that is one of the things that when I'm quilting it, I will definitely have to take into account that it may not be 100% as flat as I would like it to, and do a little extra stitching in the ditch and securing these areas because you are working with completely biased edges. And so you would want to maybe stitch in the ditch to keep this firm and in place.
Even if it's a basting stitch.
Right, exactly.
I would do that, Margo.
To keep it basted, exactly. To keep it completely square as I'm quilting
My
it.
suggestion to you when I look at it, I love how you have this in the center. It repeats here. It repeats here. The next should be, in my opinion,
Yep,
and it's my opinion, the binding.
yep,
Because it just keeps coming out. It's the solar flare.
right. It does.
So maybe you had a different choice in mind, but that's what I see.
Well,
when I
there's a
look at
stripe
it.
that comes with it that you're supposed to cut on the bias, but I agree with you. I like this hexagon print a lot, and I think I might use that as the binding on this too.
It's kind of like cooking, Margo.
Yeah.
A recipe is a suggestion,
Right.
and you can make changes as long as the success of the overall product is the same
Yeah.
and is pleasing.
And that's what I did here, that I made this one bigger to account for this because I wanted to change the way I did the outside border. So I did change the quilt a little bit to my own
Yes.
taste and liking.
It
So,
is beautiful.
It turned out really nice, and I can't wait so the next stage after this will be our reveal party. You're not
Yes.
gonna quite be done with yours for the reveal party, but maybe you can reveal some of it
Yes.
when we do. So it will take me a little bit of time to quilt this. So I say we will probably have a reveal party in the near future, but
Okay.
not in the next 2 weeks.
No.
It's gonna be a little longer. So I would say next month we'll have a reveal party to see how this looks and what all it came out to be.
I'm very excited.
So
Margo.
I am looking forward to it too. I know we have another person in our store, Sue, that's working on hers
Right.
too.
Right.
And she had hers finished and was ready to go to the quilting stage next also.
But she's leaving for a cruise for 3 weeks, so that gives us time to
That
finish
does give
ours.
us time to finish ours. So anyway, hey, we hope that you've learned something out of this. If you have some questions, get to a sticking point, need some suggestions, feel free to let us know. We're happy to help with anything that you have. We'll try and figure it out. But believe me, when I got to this section and I had a little bit too much fabric in the side borders, I was like, I've got to fix it now because
Gotta problem solve.
I can't fix it
No.
later.
No.
So anyway, so I tried to solve the problem the best I could.
I
Now
think you
before we
did a
put the
great
borders
job.
on it. So I think, and I'm really liking the
Great
way it's
job.
turning out. And we hope you're enjoying your solar flare. Hey, happy sewing, everybody.
Thank you.